back everybody into our journey into Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, the set releasing on the 18th of February. We have a huge dump of sneak peeks for today. They may be releasing some tomorrow, not really sure. With how many cards they released today, could be all of them. But we'll only know tomorrow, but for today, let's jump into it. But first, some caffeine. I need to go for a second. Now I'm ready. Alright. We're going to start with white. As always, we're probably going to break this up into a few parts. Normally we break it up into two, but with how many cards we released today, could very well be three. So let's try to get through this with white first. Sorry, the Blade Blizzard Kite Soon is a 3-mana 2/2 Fox Ninja with ninjutsu for 4 mana. It has double strike. So the ninjutsu being more expensive than the cost of the card is not ideal, but I totally get it. With this card coming out on the board and already not being blocked, then it's not dealing 2 damage to the opponent, it's dealing 4 since it deals this damage twice. That's what double strike does. Makes this card much more valuable. So if you can guarantee it's not being blocked, yeah, I can see it being more expensive. I think double strike is better to take out another creature that's on the board. Double strike means that it's going to deal us damage. At the same time, first strike would normally deal it, and then again during the normal damage step. That's why it's dealing double damage to the opponent. But I can definitely see why ninjutsu would still be more expensive, even though that's not the ideal situation. That you don't want it to be not blocked. If it does double strike, you do want to take out something. But double damage to your opponent is not bad. That's why it's more expensive. And I think this is a good card. It's great for ninja cards. I still think the blue-black ninja deck is going to be the better deck, but this is a great ninja card. Alright, next we talk about Dragonfly Suit. It's a 3-mana vehicle, 3 power, 2 toughness. It has flying, and requires just 1 for crew. So as long as you have a creature with power 1, then it'll pilot it. It can be bigger than 1, so if you have a power 3, you can still pilot this, but it's more effective with smaller creatures. And you've got a lot of samurai who have low power. They're meant to be modified, so they start with low power. Usually you're buffing them up, but this is a great card with anything that's on the board. It's almost as if you're giving a creature that didn't have flying before, you're giving it flying. So I mean, if you're piloting this with a power of 1, you've upgraded its power to 3, and this is protecting it also, because the idea is supposed to be that it's piloting this Dragonfly Suit. If it gets destroyed, your creature is just tapped, it's not dead, but this vehicle would be dead. So I think that in that way, these suits are a pretty interesting way to get around equipments. With the downside of these being crewed for the most part, I think that the pilots make most of these vehicles useful, but I think this is probably one of the 2 vehicles we've seen so far in the sneak previews that I actually like. I'm not a fan of the equipments with the additional mana cost to equip it to something, not even really with the reconfigure on the artifact equipment creatures, but with this vehicle, I think it does a great job of protecting the creature that's piloting it, while almost giving it an upgrade for a lower mana cost than you'd expect. Next, we talk about Eiganjo Exemplar. 2 mana, human samurai. It's an enchantment creature. It's a power 2, toughness 1, and whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It's not bad. It's not great. It is buffing up another card temporarily. You want to see with these samurais a lot of permanent effects if you can. And I say that because they seem to be comboing pretty well with the modification. This being an enchantment creature does help pull it out of your graveyard with a lot of these pull-out enchantments from your graveyard. It being a samurai is good, and a human's good for white decks. They combo usually pretty well with humans and angels. So I definitely think that you run this in a samurai deck if you're already running it. It's a low enough power to where it makes sense to run it in a vehicle deck for the red-white, and a samurai deck for the mono-white. And I think in my green-white modification deck, it still maybe has a place. But since it's not modifying another creature, it's just temporarily giving it +1/+1. I am less excited about it. It's not a top pick for that deck. I think it's more of just, it does synergize. It's also a samurai. If it attacks alone, it'll pop off other samurai effects. So in that way, it's got some synergy, even if its effect isn't all that impressive. But it's not bad either. So it's not something you're drawing and wishing you had gotten something else, I think. I don't think you run 4 of these, but I think you run a couple. Next, we talk about Farewell, which is a 6-mana sorcery where you choose one or more effects. You either exile all artifacts, exile all creatures, exile all enchantments, and or exile all graveyards. This is a fantastic effect. I get why it's as expensive as it is, but I still think it's a card you run just to have a response to as many things as you need in one card. I think you maybe run even 2 of these with that expensive mana cost. You're definitely not incentivized to run a bunch of them. Maybe you do just run 1, but I think you run at least 1. I think maybe 2 in your deck just to have an answer to vehicles, to have an answer to flooding the board, to have an answer to a bunch of enchantments you're up against. Maybe you're not running an enchantment deck, or maybe you are and most of yours are gotten rid of and your opponent's getting some on the board. And of course, exiling all graveyards is great for white. It's just a great answer to a lot of different types of decks where you pull from the graveyard. So I think that last effect is a little bit situational in the sense that it depends on what deck you're running if you're pulling things from your graveyard, especially since white has things that pulls from the graveyard now, especially these enchantments that it's pulling out, and some artifacts. So the last one is more of a Hail Mary, but I think that the card overall is really good. I definitely think you run it. And I think if you run it in the right deck, you might even run 2, despite the high mana cost. Alright, next we go to the Golden Tail Disciple, a 3 mana, Fox Monk, enchantment creature, 2 power, 3 toughness, and lifelink. I mean, it's an okay card. It doesn't really combo well with a whole lot of things, aside from the fact that it's an enchantment, unless you're putting it in a Fox deck. But 3 mana, 2/3 lifelink, that's not terrible. So just for the stat line you're getting, of course I'd prefer it be a 2 mana, 2/3, but it's giving you lifelink. So I think it's an okay card. I do think it's a bit slow, especially for white decks that don't have any card draw. You're really wanting every card to matter. So I don't think that you run this card, but it's a simple enough card where at least it has enough value where if you've played it, then it's not costing you anything. It's 3 mana, you get on turn 3, it's 2/3 lifelink. It's not bad. Alright, that moves us to Imperial Oath, another 6 mana card, sorcery. Create 3 2/2 white samurai creature tokens that have vigilance, and then it also allows you to scry 3. It's not a bad card, especially since it's creating samurai, and it creates a good synergy with anything that's samurai warrior attacking alone stuff. You don't mind if your tokens die, just have them attack and activate other effects. And of course, scrying is really good in a white deck. I'm not used to seeing a lot of scry in any white decks, so this is a great way to speed up the white cards. Make sure that the cards you're drawing really matter. So I like it. I think scrying around turn 6 is the only problem I have, because by turn 6, I think if you are still really needing to scry and the game's not close to over around that time, I mean, I feel like depending on the game you're playing, turn 6 is more than halfway through with the game already, and scrying is still important, but it's not as useful as if you had done it on the first few turns to make sure you set up a good mana curve. At this point, you're scrying just to make sure you're getting big cards out, I suppose. So again, not bad. It's just that 6 mana does change how useful it is at that point in the game. It also changes what you'd be scrying for. But I guess overall it's still a good card, especially with the samurai tokens. If you didn't get the samurai tokens, I think this card wouldn't be worth it. If it said it created 3 2/2 white human tokens, it probably wouldn't be worth it. But I guess because it's a samurai and it synergizes well with other samurai, I do think that this card has a place in those decks. Just really almost got to the point to where I was like, no, it's not a good card. But I think this is okay. Alright, next we move on to our next vehicle, which is the Imperial Recovery Unit. For 3 mana, you're getting a 3/4 that whenever this card attacks, return target creature or vehicle card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. And then it also has crew 2. It's not bad. You're upgrading from a power 2 to a power 3. So as long as you have a creature on the board with power 2 or greater, you want to stick it to a 2 if you can. 3 is okay because at least you're protecting it, but you tap that creature and you can now attack with this vehicle. And whenever it attacks, it at least gives you the ability to pull back up a vehicle card or a creature card with a mana value 2 or less. I think you're probably pulling a creature from your graveyard, but either way, that's not a problem. You pull out a samurai who will help combo with other samurai, or you're pulling out, again, I think in these vehicle decks, I do think it's a white-red, And there's a lot of goblins with low mana cost too. You can pull out a goblin from your graveyard and put it back in your hand, and it'll help pilot other vehicles too. So I definitely think that this is a good card. I don't know how many vehicles you're pulling out with it, but I do think you're pulling out creatures who are going to help pilot other vehicles. So really good card, and I definitely think it fits in the vehicle deck. Let's talk about the Intercessors Arrest. It is a 3-mana enchantment aura that whenever the enchanted permanent cannot attack, block, or crew vehicles, and its activated abilities cannot be activated unless they are mana abilities. So if it requires the creature to tap, or if it requires you to sacrifice it, it seems you wouldn't be able to do that either. I'm used to you at least being able to sacrifice your creature if it has an effect that allows you to do so. This is an interesting kind of arrest, and I think normally the card that's just called Arrest is still a 3-mana card. So this is almost feels like a reprint of that card, saying, hey, we know vehicles are becoming a bigger deal. We want to make sure you can't crew a vehicle. We want to make sure you can't tap your card at all. We want to make sure that you can't attack or block still, and that its activated abilities can't be activated with a caveat. So now, if it's just a mana cost ability, you can use that still. I think it's a great card. And don't forget, it counts with an enchantment aura, and that is a modification. So if you are playing against a modification deck, that is a downer for this card, because that would be a modification to one of your opponent's cards. That being said, I think it's still well worth it. I think this is a good card. And in terms of what you run it in, certainly you run it in a anti-vehicle deck, but I think just in general, this is a good white card answer to a lot of different things your opponents are going to try to do. It's better to, of course, exile your opponent's cards, but I think this is a good enough card to run one, maybe two of in any white deck. Alright, and that brings us to Kite Soon Ace, which is a 2-mana Fox Pilot, 2/2, that whenever a vehicle you control attacks, you choose one of two effects. You either give that vehicle first strike until the end of the turn, or you untap this card. I like that. The reason, so this definitely goes in a vehicle deck. So whenever you pilot another vehicle, you do have to tap the card. So this is a good way of, it taps to pilot another vehicle, it attacks, and now I untap this card. It can block. I don't know if you're using it to block. I think more than likely what you're doing is you're giving your vehicle first strike. But the ability to untap this card on its own whenever a vehicle attacks is pretty good. And it's 2 mana 2/2, which is already what you expect for that stat line for the mana cost you're paying for it. So definitely this is a must run in the vehicle deck. So I like to see the vehicle decks getting more support, and I like to see it coming from the white section here, because white and red was the vehicle deck, mostly because I saw a lot of the support coming from the artifact cards in red specifically, and with a lot more support coming from the white cards, and they're coming from other non-samurai cards. I think that this definitely tosses up maybe allowing the blue-white to be a good vehicle deck at this point, but it's still hard to tell. I definitely think blue needs a bit more support to make that a good deck, but now we're seeing more cards on the white section supporting these vehicle decks. I think that that doesn't make it to where the red-white is the only viable vehicle deck besides the mono-red. I think that maybe, I don't think you run a mono-white, but I think we're getting pretty close to seeing a white vehicle deck running pretty well. And I'd like to see some more support for the blue, but we're going to get to that. Alright, next up we talk about Lucky Offering. Lucky Offering is a 1-mana sorcery that allows you to destroy target artifact with a mana value of 3 or less, and then you gain 3 life. Pretty normal, pretty standard for a white card to allow you to gain life. For 1 mana, destroying an artifact, so long as its mana value is 3 or less, means that this is most likely an early game card, and so that for that reason I'm not as fan of it. Most cards that allow you to destroy an artifact are instants, and this one's a sorcery. So I think this is too slow, too situational, very specific to an early game card. So even with a life gain, and keep in mind, I think life gain, as long as it's doing something else, is good, but in this sense, I think you're playing the card and you're only doing it in the turn 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4, but depending on when they played their artifact. But I still think it's just too slow. I think there are better cards out there that, for white even, for 1 more mana, I think you get to exile artifacts, so I think that this ends up being too slow. Let's talk about the Moth Rider Patrol. It's a 1-mana Fox Warrior. It's a 1/1 with flying, and for 4 mana, and you must tap this card, you can tap target creature. You're used to seeing that in a blue deck, So it's interesting to see that in white. White does a lot of tapping your opponent's cards, but blue does a lot of tap and it doesn't untap on its next untap step, so it ends up being stronger in blue, that mechanic. The only reason why white uses it is for swarming purposes. That turn you're attacking with a bunch, but you're still leaving yourself open to your opponent's next turn. The other reason why you do it is there are cards that allow you to destroy tapped creatures. I think we even saw one in this set so far, which of course, once we get into this comprehensive review, I'll be taking a closer look at all of these cards. But this is a 1/1 with flying for 1 mana. That's pretty good. The activated abilities, meh. But also keep in mind this is a warrior, and that matters because if a warrior attacks alone, and you've got one of those samurai cards on the board that says whenever a samurai or warrior you control attacks alone, this thing happens. This does count towards that. But I think it might be more meant for a vehicle deck. That being said, I'm not sure how excited I'd be to see it in a vehicle deck, since there's a lot of pilots that have a power of 1 but can crew a vehicle as if it had 2 more power than it does. So it's not a bad card. I do think it's too slow for a white deck, even with it being a 1 mana 1/1 flying, which is pretty fine. I mean, that's fine. It's just I'm not excited about it, and when we're looking at all these other cards that are definitely must runs, I think you compare this to other cards of its value and it just ends up falling a bit short. And for a white deck, every card, as I said before, needs to matter, and I think this is one of those ones where of course you play it turn 1, but on the later turns when you do have that 4 mana, I don't think it's worth 4 mana to tap your opponent's creatures. I think that's a 2 mana ability, so it's just too slow. Let's talk about the next card. Regent's Authority. For 1 mana is an instant that target creature gets +2/+2 until the end of the turn, and if it's an enchantment creature or a legendary creature, you instead put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So it's still the same effect later. It's just kind of one's done in a modification way. So it wants you to modify a card so long as it's an enchantment creature or it's a legendary creature, so it's not bad because it does allow you to modify. It would be better if it guaranteed a modification. Since it doesn't, it may be too slow. Do you still run it in a modification deck? Maybe. You at least run this in your samurai deck where you are temporarily buffing up a samurai so it can more confidently attack by itself. But I still feel like it falls just a bit short. It's not a terrible card. Maybe run one of it just for some padding in your deck, but it's not a great card, and it's certainly not one that is a must run. Next we talk about Repel the Vial. It is a 4 mana instant where you choose one of 2 abilities. You either exile target creature with power 4 or greater, or you exile target enchantment. For 4 mana, that makes this a rough card to evaluate. Exiling target enchantment is more of a 2 mana ability, so I don't know you pay 4 mana to do that. I think the question is it worth 4 mana to exile a creature with power 4 or greater? And it might be. I feel like that's more of a 3 mana card, but it could be a 4 mana card. It's tough to evaluate this card. I guess it depends on how many, because I feel like this is an anti-vehicle or a modification deck. It's an instant, so you wait until a vehicle becomes crewed by something else, by another creature, because that's when that vehicle becomes an artifact creature until the end of the turn. And then you play this card and you exile that vehicle, and then you run it in a modification deck where you've got a creature that has reached enough power to where it's a threat to you. Maybe it has trample as well, and then you use this to exile that creature. That's what I think this is best used for. If you're wanting to exile the enchantment, I think you run other cards. I know Saga enchantments are a bigger deal, so maybe they're just trying to give you more cards that would do the same thing as other cards, and so they're giving them different names and different effects and increasing the mana cost. And I think the reason why this is a higher mana cost is because it's giving you the ability to choose a target, and I think that they're valuing that at a mana, but I'm not evaluating that at a mana. I think that this is probably a 4 mana exile target creature with power 4 or greater, and it still may even be worth it depending on how strong these other decks end up being, but I do think it being an instant is the only reason why it would be an okay card. I think you probably run this, especially when the set first releases, because you're going to see a lot of these decks being run that this is an answer to. But I think as the meta slows down, I think this card ends up being too slow, and you do take this out. Alright, let's talk about the next card. Alright, we only have 2 more cards in the white sneak peek. So our next one is Touch the Spirit Realm. It's a 3-mana enchantment that when it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target artifact or creature until this leaves the battlefield. It also has a channel ability for 2 mana, and you discard this card. You can exile target artifact or creature, and you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So I think that the channel ability is really good because it will at least remove counters that are on the card. Enchantments that are on it will be destroyed. So this is a good card if you've got stuff modifying a card. So you just channel and you can get rid of the modifications. And the card by itself that's coming back probably isn't that big a deal. If there's a card that is a big enough deal to where you need this to come in the board, 3 mana, exile a creature until this is gone. That's a good card still. So this is definitely a run in the white deck. I think it is slow enough to where it might just be 1 in the deck that you run, but you definitely run at least 1. I could see 2 being in the deck. I don't think you run more than that, because if you draw this card, it is just a response to one thing your opponent's doing, and you don't want to run just responses in your hand. You want to have something that you're doing, because that's the game. You have to win. So just because you have responses to what your opponent's doing, you're slowing them down. If you don't have some sort of response, then for yourself, like this is what I'm doing to win the game, then it ends up being much too slow of a card. So 1, I think, is an easy call. I don't think you run more than 1, but I could see 2. I just feel like later on, as the meta slows down again, you bring it down to 1. I think this is just one of those responses you have because of the set that's being released. And then our final one for the white set is Wanderer's Intervention, which is a 2-mana instant. It deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. As an instant, this will happen before the damage step happens, almost as if it had first strike. So this is a pretty good card. It'll help protect your samurai for sure. Your samurai are attacking by themselves. I think that they get blocked by 1 creature just because, well, you're attacking with your samurai because you're trying to activate these other abilities. So I'm at least going to kill the samurai you attacked with. Then you play this card and say, not only did I activate the other abilities, but I'm going to deal 4 damage to this creature. Probably end up killing the creature that you chose to block the samurai with. So let's get rid of your card. All these other effects have happened, and then next turn I can attack with that samurai again. I think that's the purpose of this card, and so I can see this being an amazing card. Otherwise, I could see this in a ninja deck as well, just because of people being afraid of ninjutsu. They may be more likely to block a deck if they know it's block a card if they know it's a ninja deck. They may be more incentivized to say, okay, I'm going to block this card because I have no idea if you have ninjutsu cards in your hand, or maybe I saw you pull it back up, you've got one in your hand, so you know what, I'm just going to block all your creatures. And this is another way to counteract that response that your opponent's going to have and say, well, that's fine that you blocked my creature, I'm going to kill this one off. And so it's a good way to establish board control, or to maintain board control, depending on where you're at in the game. So this is definitely a good card. Alright. Let's go ahead and talk about the blue cards. And I think after this, we're going to break it up into the next part. So let's jump into blue. So the first card we're going to talk about is Disruption Protocol. It is a 2-mana instant. As an additional cost to casting the spell, you tap an untapped artifact that you control, or you may pay a colorless mana, and then you counter target spell. It's a bit expensive for a counterspell card. You're used to those being nowadays 2 mana. There is Cancel, which is 3 mana, and I guess this is sort of trying to combo with that. So you could just pay 3 mana to counter a spell. I think people are used to just countering spells in other ways now with 2 mana. But I think this ends up being an okay card, especially in a deck where if you're trying to run some more counter spells. And if you're running a vehicle deck, then this is probably an easy cost. But I think that it's probably just a little less valuable, so you don't run it in the blue deck. Blue has a lot of good cards. It runs really fast, so you don't have to have amazing value cards, but there's just so many for blue that I think this ends up not running in the deck. But it's not a bad card overall. Next, we talk about Futurist Sentinel, which is a 4-mana vehicle. It's a 6/6 with crew 3. I wish it had trample, but a 6/6 is not bad, especially since you only need a total power of 3 to crew this card. You're doubling that power, and you're protecting it with this suit, so this is a really good card. And seeing some blue support for the vehicles are good, because I'd like to see a blue-white vehicle deck be something that could work. So I like to see this card in the blue set specifically, so I think this could be a good card, and I definitely think that if you do run a blue-white vehicle deck, that this is one of the ones you run. Then we talk about the shrine for the blue cards, which is Go Shintai of Lost Wisdom. It is a 2 mana legendary enchantment creature. It's a shrine. A 0/4 with flying, so it's really just meant as a blocker, but we don't expect the shrines to do a whole lot of damage. I'm surprised that they're vehicles at all. I mean, that they're creatures at all, I should say. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay a mana, and when you do, target player mills X cards, where X is the number of shrines that you control. Once again, we see it comboing with shrines. Pretty standard for the shrine cards. I think milling is more of a black deck mechanic, forcing your opponent to discard the top cards of their deck into their library, into their graveyard. I think even for 1 mana, make your opponent discard the top card. It's probably okay. 0/4 with flying is good for 2 mana. That's the right stat line. It's a good blocker. But I think it ends up being too slow. I don't think that you run it in the blue decks. So I feel like I'm missing something with these shrines. Every time I see a shrine, I'm like, yeah, I'm not really a big fan of this card. But I'd like to see the shrines do well. There is some shrine support from previous sets, but this set is capitalizing on something that's already existed, and I'd like to see a shrine deck work, especially with these cards in it. I just have never run shrines, and I've not seen a shrine deck play competitively. Next, we talk about the March card of the blue set, which is March of Swirling Mist. It's X mana, 1 blue mana. An instant where still if you exile a blue card from your hand, or you can exile as many as you need to, and the spell will cost 2 colorless mana less to cast, and it will allow you to up to X target creatures will phase out. So phasing out means that you treat the creature as if it doesn't exist until your next turn. I like to see a card that does phasing out. So of the March cards, this is one of the better ones. Yeah, I can see this being good, especially if you're running this in a blue-black ninja deck. That's where I see the use of this card. But yes, I do see this being valuable. You have your cards on the board be phased out. I don't know. It's a good way to protect your cards. And so then you can have the ability to get to your opponent easier with keeping board control. I guess it's just a tough card to evaluate. I'd say of the March cards, it's probably one of the better ones, but the more I think about it, you're treating the cards as if they don't exist. I'd have to see the ruling on it, but that makes me think that maybe they can't even deal damage. And if they can't deal damage, then what's the point of ninjutsu at that point? Phasing them out doesn't help. All you're doing is protecting them until your next turn. If that's the case, it's probably too slow of a card. I'd have to look up the ruling on it. Haven't seen phase out in a while, and I'd have to see if phase out allows you to deal any damage. If it does, I could see the combo being really really good, because then you can have them be unblocked and then they deal damage. But if you're treating the creatures as if they don't exist, then creatures that don't exist can't deal damage. So I'm leaning on this card doesn't actually allow them to attack. So I'm going to say this probably isn't a good card. And we'll move on. So next we move to the minelink mech for 3 mana, another vehicle, which is a 4/3 with flying. Whenever it becomes crewed for the first time each turn until the end of the turn, this becomes a copy of target non-legendary creature that crewed it this turn. And except it's a 4/3, it's a vehicle artifact in addition to its other types, and it has flying. So it definitely still upgrades the card, still gives it flying, still gives it more power and toughness, so you can still crew it with a creature that's a power 1. And if this is a copy of that card, it could be that if this deals damage, X happens, or it could be it has Death Touch if you're doing it right. This is a good vehicle, and it doesn't even have to combo with that effect, really. A 4/3 flying that's crewed with a power 1 is already good. I think these vehicles are looking better and better the more cards I'm seeing. I love this card. I think a blue-white vehicle deck may be a good way to go. I still think the Goblin vehicle deck is good, but the blue vehicles and the white vehicles are looking pretty good now, so I'm really excited about that. Our next card is Mirrorshell Crab, which is a 7 mana, Ward 3, 5/7 with Channel. For 3 mana, you discard this card, and target spell or ability is countered unless its controller pays 3 mana. I like that it has Ward 3, where your opponent has to pay 3 mana to target this. 7 mana is the thing that really makes me not sure how good this card is. It's an artifact creature. Power 5, toughness 7 is good, but it doesn't have trample, doesn't have flying. Doesn't even really have Island Walk, which I don't think is really much of a thing that they do anymore. And for 3 mana, counter target spell or ability unless its controller pays 3 mana, and you discard this card in the process. This card I think ends up being too slow. The ward ability is really good. It's not as good as Hexproof still, but it's good since 3 mana is a high enough cost to where your opponent has to plan around that before they're playing a card. Yeah, I think it probably is too slow of a card. Took me a minute to think about it. It's just with a high mana cost of 7 mana, I think that the 5/7 stat line is not what you're looking for. Sure, it has ward, but what's the point of ward if this card doesn't establish much of a threat? Your opponent can block it with a 1/1. Human token, spirit token, whatever. So, that's probably too slow of a card. I like the card, and it's great. It's a great artwork. I love seeing it under the water. I just feel like it's too slow of a card. It being an artifact creature, to me, makes it less valuable because there are more cards that target artifacts, and there are creature cards as well. So, without trample, without flying, without any ability that makes it more of a threat, I think it can have ward 3, and I don't think anyone's really going to care about it. So, 5/7 is a threat. Your opponent will have to respond to it at some point, but without it having a more immediate threat on the board for 7 mana, I think it just wastes that turn. And you almost always have to use the channel ability, and for 3 mana and you're discarding the card, so almost like you're casting an instant, to counter target spell or ability unless its controller pays 3 mana, is only good because it allows you to counter an ability. Because you can counter a spell for 3 mana with a lot of different cards, for 2 mana with some cards. Counting the ability is what makes this a better card, and for 3 mana it may be worth it. But I don't think that you run this card just for that. So, too slow of a card. And we look at Mnemonic Sphere, a 2 mana artifact. For 2 mana, sacrifice Mnemonic Sphere, draw 2 cards, and it has channel. For 1 mana, you discard this, you draw a card. That's a good card. Drawing 2 cards for 3 mana is what you're used to. But for 2 mana, you get it out of your hand, so you can fill up your hand again if you want to. And then just choose to sacrifice this at another time to draw 2 cards. I think that's where the usefulness is that this is not sitting in your hand. So it's worth that extra mana to be able to choose when you're drawing the cards. And if your opponent chooses to target this artifact and destroy it while it's on the board, you lost card draw, but they lost an answer to an artifact card. So you run this in a blue-white artifact vehicle deck, then that makes it even better because your opponent shouldn't really be responding to this card. So I think it sits out, I think it's safe, and I think you get to choose when you draw cards. So, I like this card. Moonfolk Puzzle Maker is the next one. For 3 mana, it's an artifact creature, and it's a Moonfolk Wizard. It is a 1 power 4 toughness card with flying, and that whenever she becomes tapped, you scry 1. That's cute. I think that you attack with her. On turn 3, your player should be a 2/3 for 3 mana, I feel like, but still you attack with her. At some point she dies. So every time you attack with her, you scry. If your opponent doesn't kill her off because she's not much of a threat, then at some point you just get more value off this card than she really should have given you. And I think that's where she comes in for the value, is the sneaky, at some point your opponent's going to realize, wait, you've been scrying just about every turn and I haven't killed your 1/4 because it's not much of a threat. So I think this is a good card. It combos well with wizards, and it combos well with moonfolk, and it combos well with artifacts. So, it's a good card. I don't think you run it in your blue-white vehicle deck, and I don't think you run it in your blue-black ninja deck, but I think just as a card, it's a good card. I just don't know if it fits in any deck that I'm really excited about for this set. Next, we talk about Planar Incision, a 2 mana blue spell. It's instant. Exile target artifact or creature, and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a good card for modifying other cards. Vehicles, you can upgrade them a little bit. But I don't see the modification deck being big in the blue deck. With the blue-white vehicle deck, you're probably running Samurai, and you're probably running some Moonfolk. The Moonfolk, because we've seen some that create pilots. And of course, modifying cards make it easier to pilot a vehicle. So I could see this being run in those decks, I suppose. It's just hard for me to picture this being a card you're excited to run, but yeah, you probably run this card in that deck. If nothing else, you don't really care a whole lot about modifying your cards, but you do care about increasing the pilot's ability to pilot, or increasing the vehicle itself, so that way when it becomes a creature, has a +1/+1 counter on it, so it becomes a slightly stronger vehicle. The vehicles already seem to have pretty good value. This just increases it a little bit. So I suppose overall this is a good card. I'm not sure how many you run in it. I'm not sure how long it stays in that deck, but I think it's certainly a good card. Alright, next we talk about Short Circuit. Is a 2-mana enchantment aura with flash. Enchant artifact or creature, and as long as it is a creature, it gets -3/-0 and loses flying. Yeah, I don't think it's a good card. If you're wanting it to lose flying, that's good. I think this card is best played when your opponent's attacking with a flying creature. You have nothing that's going to kill that creature that has flying. You play this on your opponent's turn as an instant. That's what flash allows you to do. And you immediately enchant your opponent's creature, making their attack lower, and you're making it fall to the ground, and then you block it with one of your creatures or more that you have that don't have flying, and then you kill that creature. It's just, because it's only good, I think in that situation, it's very situational. So I think it just ends up being too slow. But it's a very interesting card, and if you can pull off that combo, it is really cool. I just don't think that it's worth it to run this in your deck for a specific combo. So next we'll talk about Sky Swimmer Koi. It is a 4-mana fish, 3/3 with flying, and that whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card, and if you do, discard a card. It would be a stronger card if you were just drawing cards, especially since it's a fish and doesn't combo well with vehicles. And I think that this is really meant to be running an artifact heavy deck, which right now seems to be the vehicles. So since it requires you to discard a card as well, it's nice to be able to set up your hand, but it's not worth it to run a fish in your deck to do that. You've got other boost spells that'll do that for you, so this card is too slow, especially for 4 mana. Next up, we talk about Suit Up. A 3-mana instant. Until the end of the turn, target creature or vehicle becomes an artifact creature with a base power and toughness 4/5 and draw a card. For 3 mana, this is a great card. You can either upgrade one of your creatures or upgrade one of your vehicles, and it also replaces itself. This is a must run in the vehicle decks. I think you run 3, maybe even 4 of these cards. And that does it for our blue cards. So we'll go ahead and break up this video, and we will tune back in starting with the black cards. Again, there's a ton of cards that were shown in this sneak peek. It makes me feel like that they're probably not going to do one for tomorrow. So feel free to drop a comment down below. Talk about some of the cards that you were excited about, cards that you think are better than what I thought, cards that you think are even better than I thought. And let's talk about that a little bit, and I'll see you for part 2, it looks like. Hopefully we can keep it to 2 parts, so like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.